Okay, think about this, right? Like from a simple Band-Aid in your first aid kit to like a complex MRI machine you see at the hospital,
Yeah.
these medical devices, they're kind of like the unsung heroes, right,
Mm.
of healthcare. I mean, they diagnose, they treat, and some even help us modify our bodies to be healthier.
Yeah.
But have you ever thought about how these devices get from, like, the scientist lab to the doctor's office?
Right.
It's like a whole world of rules and regulations to make sure they're safe and effective.
Definitely.
Now, before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to London Heartbeat Z Academy.
Yes.
They've been incredibly supportive with education and all. They have over 150 courses. They're like your go-to for everything healthcare. You can find them on Facebook, Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube.
Wow.
Subscribe so you can keep up with their latest courses and join in on more great discussions like this one. So today we're going to dive deep, right, deep into the world of medical device regulations. We're going to journey through the US, the European Union, and even India to see how they make sure these essential tools are safe and ready to improve our lives. So what's the first thing that pops into your head when you hear medical device?
You might automatically think of all those high-tech complex machines,
Right.
but it's actually way broader than that. The presentation even defines a medical device as any article, instrument, apparatus, or machine.
Okay.
And its purpose is to prevent, diagnose, or treat illnesses,
Sure.
or even modify the body for a health-related reason.
Interesting.
So we're talking everything from like basic bandages to complex heart valves.
Wow, that's a pretty big range.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how many different devices we use in healthcare.
Yeah.
But like regulating a bandage is going to be way different than regulating a heart valve, right?
Yeah, for sure. You're totally right. Not all medical devices have the same risks, so they can't be regulated the same way.
Right.
And this is where medical device classification comes in. Different regions have different systems, but they all look at how risky a device is for the user.
So in the US, how do they do it? I'm curious about their system.
So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they use a three-tiered system, right, to classify medical devices based on their risk.
Mhm.
So Class I devices, those are considered low risk, like think elastic bandages or like a tongue depressor. They're straightforward, pretty unlikely to cause harm if used correctly.
Yeah, makes sense.
Then you've got Class 2 devices. They're moderate risk. These include things like powered wheelchairs or infusion pumps. They need a bit more scrutiny because they could potentially cause harm if they malfunction.
Okay, so a bit more oversight for those.
Yeah, definitely. And lastly, you've got Class 3 devices. These are the high-risk ones.
Ah,
This is where you'll find like heart valves, artificial hip joints, things that are implanted in the body or are essential to keeping you alive.
right.
These devices go through the most rigorous testing and oversight.
Makes sense. The higher the risk, the more carefully they got to look at it.
Exactly.
So now I'm wondering, like, where do things like thermometers or contact lenses
Yeah.
fit into all of this?
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about the classification of things we use all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about like the whole journey of a medical device,
Mhm.
from the factory to the patient. What are the big phases in that process?
So the presentation breaks it down into three main phases.
Yeah.
You start with the manufacturer. They're responsible for the entire life cycle of the device.
Right.
So like from the initial idea and design to manufacturing, packaging, even labeling.
That's a lot.
It's a huge job, and they have to stick to really strict quality standards every step of the way.
Makes sense.
Then you have the vendor. They're focused on getting the device to healthcare providers. So that involves marketing, advertising, and sales.
So they're the ones getting it out there.
Exactly. And then finally, you've got the user, the person actually using the device for its intended purpose.
Right.
This phase also includes, eventually disposing of the device, which brings us full circle.
That's interesting. It really is a whole cycle. It involves so many different people with different roles.
Mm-hmm.
But let's focus on the regulatory process.
Okay.
Getting a medical device approved for sale in the US, I imagine that's not easy.
Oh, absolutely not. The FDA approval process is super rigorous, and for good reason,
Yeah.
Patient safety is paramount. The process has 10 key steps, and it starts with device classification, which we just talked about.
Right.
This first step is really important because it sets the path the manufacturer needs to follow for the whole regulatory process.
So once they know what class their device is, then what?
Okay, so next is making sure they comply with quality management systems. or QMS for short. It's all about setting up and keeping a really solid system to make sure the device is consistently produced and controlled to strict quality standards. Like, think of it as a recipe book for the device.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sure every device is made exactly the same way and meets the same quality bar.
So very meticulous.
Yeah.
So after they've got their QMS in place, what's the next hurdle?
So for Class 2 and Class 3 devices, often the next step is doing clinical studies
Okay.
to show that the device is safe and effective in humans. This means carefully planned trials with human subjects. It's a really important step in proving that the device actually does what it's supposed to do and doesn't pose any crazy risks.
Right, it has to actually work.
Exactly. But before they can even begin these clinical studies, for Class 2 and Class 3 devices, manufacturers have to apply for an investigational device exemption, or IDE, from the FDA.
Okay.
This lets them test the device in a controlled clinical setting.
So the testing gets pretty serious for those higher risk devices.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm looking at this process, and there's a step called pre-sub.
Oh, yeah.
What's that all about?
That's a really smart thing the FDA's done. The pre-sub lets manufacturers have a meeting with the FDA, like a preliminary meeting, to get feedback on their testing plans and regulatory strategy before they submit their full application.
Oh, so they can get some early input.
Yeah, it's like a trial run to make sure they're on the right track. It could save them tons of time and money in the long run.
That's smart. So after the clinical trials and the pre-sub, what's the next step to getting approval?
All right, so now it's time for the official submission. For Class 2 devices, manufacturers prepare a 510(k) pre-market notification. But for Class 3 devices, they need a pre-market approval, or PMA, application. Both these submissions include all the data from the development and testing phases, showing that the device meets the FDA's standards for safety and effectiveness. And of course, there are fees for each type of submission.
So all their work goes into this one big package.
Exactly.
What happens when the FDA gets these submissions?
So for Class 3 devices, the FDA actually goes and inspects the manufacturing facilities of all the major suppliers involved in the design and production process.
Oh, wow.
This is to ensure that the quality control is top-notch across the entire supply chain, not just at the manufacturer's own site.
Yeah, you don't want one weak link messing up the whole thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so after inspections are done, what's the final hurdle?
Okay, so the FDA does a thorough review of the application. They look at all the data, the clinical trial results, the inspection reports, everything.
They go through it all.
They go through it all. And if they're happy, satisfied that the device meets their standards for safety and how well it works, they issue either a 510(k) clearance letter for Class 2 devices or a PMA approval letter for Class 3 devices.
So those are like the golden tickets.
Yeah, exactly. The golden tickets to the U.S. market.
Okay.
And to be transparent, these letters are posted publicly on the FDA website.
So everything's out in the open. That's good. So they got the approval. Can they just start selling the device right away?
Not quite. So if the manufacturer doesn't actually have a physical presence in the U.S., they need to appoint a U.S. agent.
Okay.
This agent acts as their point of contact, so it ensures smooth communication and that they follow all the regulations.
So they need someone on the ground in the U.S.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. And what happens after they've appointed their U.S. agent?
Okay, the next step is to list the device on the FDA website, which involves paying registration and listing fees.
Ah, okay.
And this listing has to be renewed every year so they can keep selling the device in the U.S.
So it's not just a one-time approval. They got to keep up with the paperwork.
Exactly.
But after all that, they're finally good to go, right? They can sell their device in the U.S.
Yes, after all those steps, they can finally sell their device. And the good news is that this authorization doesn't expire unless they change the device's design or what it's meant to be used for.
Wow, that's quite a process. Getting a medical device approved in the U.S. is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, definitely a marathon.
But it's good to know there's such a thorough system to keep patients safe. But the medical device world isn't just the U.S., right?
Oh, definitely not.
What's the global picture look like? Where do we go from here?
So you're absolutely right. The medical device market is global. And in terms of who has the biggest share, it's the U.S. and the European Union. Like back in 2015, the U.S. had a huge 45% market share.
Wow.
And the EU was right behind them with 30%. Japan comes in third with 10%, leaving the rest of the world to share the remaining 15%.
So with those numbers, understanding how the EU regulates medical devices seems pretty important.
Definitely.
How does their system compare to the US?
Well, the EU's regulatory system is actually pretty similar to the US system in that it's also risk-based. They also have a classification system based on risk, but they use 4 classes instead of 3.
4 classes. Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so their system is mainly based on 2 key directives: the Medical Devices Directive, or MDD, and the Active Implantable Medical Devices Directive, known as AMDD. These directives set the rules for ensuring device safety and performance in the EU.
So these directives apply to all medical devices.
Well, the MDD covers most medical devices, while the AMDD is specifically for active implantable devices, as the name suggests.
Yeah.
So how do those 4 classes fit in? What are the rules for each class?
Yeah.
Well, Annex IX of the MDD outlines the classification process. It helps manufacturers figure out which of the 4 classes their device belongs to based on how risky it is. The lowest risk category is Class 1, which includes non-sterile, non-measuring devices, so like bandages, examination gloves. Then there's Class Sterile, which obviously includes sterile, non-measuring devices like surgical drapes, syringes. Moving up the risk ladder, we have Class Thia, which is for low-risk devices, and Class I for devices with a higher risk profile. And lastly, Class 3, that's the highest risk category, and typically includes devices that are implanted in the body or essential to keeping someone alive. And active implantable medical devices usually fall under the same rules as Class 3 devices.
So they have a pretty detailed way of categorizing devices based on their potential impact on patients.
Yeah.
But what about the actual regulatory process itself? Is it as complex as the U.S.?
Oh, it's definitely thorough. And just like in the U.S., having a strong quality management system, or QMS, is really important in the EU's regulatory process.
So is a QMS required for all devices?
It's required for all devices except the very simplest Class I devices. The specifics are outlined in Annex 2 or V of the MDD. And even though a QMS isn't formally required for Class I devices, they might still be audited by a notified body.
A notified body, what's that?
Okay, a notified body is like an independent organization that's been chosen to assess whether medical devices comply with the relevant EU directives.
Got it.
They play a big role in making sure that devices meet the necessary safety and performance standards.
So it's like an extra layer of checks and balances from an outside source.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's their role in the whole approval process?
Okay, so for devices in classes I through IAB, manufacturers have to put together a technical file.
Okay.
It's a document with detailed info about the device, its design, and how it meets the essential requirements of the applicable directive. For Class 3 and AMD devices, they need to prepare a design dossier, which is similar to the technical file, but even more in-depth.
Okay, so more details for the higher risk ones.
Yeah, exactly. Both the technical file and the design dossier need to be audited by a notified body.
So even before the device is on the market, it's already been thoroughly reviewed by an independent body. That's reassuring.
Yeah.
What happens after the notified body has looked at everything?
So once they're happy that the QMS and the technical file or design dossier meet the requirements of the directives, the manufacturer can move on to the next step.
And what's next in this regulatory maze?
Okay, so if the manufacturer isn't based in the EU, the next step is to appoint a European Authorized Representative, or EAR.
Okay.
This representative is based in Europe and acts as their contact with the authorities, handling all the regulatory stuff for them.
So having someone on the ground in Europe is essential for manufacturers outside the EU.
Pretty much.
And what about the notified body? What's their role in this?
They're involved in one of the most critical parts, the CE marking.
Right.
For all devices except Class I, the notified body does audits to ensure that the device actually meets the requirements of the directives.
Got it.
This independent assessment is super important because it's how the device gets the CE marking.
The CE marking, that's like the EU's seal of approval, right?
Exactly. It means the device follows the relevant EU directives and can be legally sold in the European market. If the notified body audit is good, the manufacturer gets a European CE marking certificate for their device and an ISO 13485 certificate for their facility. These certificates show they comply with quality management standards and basically unlock the EU market.
So after all that, they finally got their CE marking and can start selling in Europe.
Almost. There's one more important step before they hit the market.
Go ahead.
They need to put together a declaration of conformity.
And what does this declaration do?
It's a legally binding document where the manufacturer officially states that their device complies with the applicable directive. It's essentially them taking responsibility for meeting all the regulatory requirements.
So it's a pretty serious document. Once they've signed it, are they good to go?
Well, for Class I devices, there's one last step. Registration with the relevant competent authority in the specific EU member state where they'll be selling the device. This registration is about traceability and oversight. But once that's done, Class I devices can be sold in the EU, and their CE marking certificates last indefinitely.
Indefinitely.
Yeah.
Wow. So does that mean they don't have to worry about any more checks or audits?
Not quite. Even though the CE marking certificate doesn't expire, manufacturers still have responsibilities. They have to continuously do post-market surveillance or PMS activities. This is about monitoring how the device performs and its safety in real-world use.
So they have to keep an eye on things.
Yeah, it's about making sure the device still meets the standards and that any potential problems are found and dealt with quickly.
So it's not a set it and forget it situation.
Yeah.
They need to stay vigilant.
Definitely.
And what about devices in other classes? Do they have similar ongoing requirements?
So for those other classes, the notified body actually conducts annual audits to make sure they're still following the directive. These audits are super important because if they fail, their CE marking certificate can be revoked, meaning they can't sell in the EU anymore. And just like with Class I devices, constant updates and PMS activities are mandatory for all medical devices sold in the EU.
Okay, so the EU is definitely thorough. I can see why these two markets are the leaders in the medical device industry.
Yeah.
But we can't forget the rest of the world.
Right.
What about India? They have their own regulatory system, don't they?
Yes, they do. India has its own system for classifying medical devices based on risk, and they use 4 categories,
Okay.
ranging from Class A, the lowest risk, to Class D, the highest risk.
And how does their approval process compare to what we've seen in the US and EU?
So it starts with appointing an Indian authorized agent. This agent is the manufacturer's representative for all the regulatory stuff with the Central Drugs Standard Control Organization, or CDSCO for short.
So it's similar to having a US agent for the FDA. What's next?
The manufacturer gives power of attorney to this authorized agent, letting them handle the whole registration process in India. This keeps things clear legally and streamlines communication with the authorities.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then they submit an official application for a device registration certificate. This goes to the CDSCO using Form 40.
Form 40 paperwork seems to be a common theme.
Yeah, pretty much.
What if the manufacturer is new to the Indian market? Is there anything different they have to do?
If it's their first time applying, they also need to submit Form 45, which gives more information about themselves and their company.
So more paperwork for first-timers.
Pretty much.
They've sent in their forms and are waiting for the CDSCO's decision. What happens next?
So the CDSCO looks at the application, and if everything checks out, they issue a registration certificate. This comes in the form of Form 41.
More forms.
Yep. This certificate is good for up to 3 years and allows the manufacturer to sell their device in India.
3 years, that's not bad. What happens after they get the registration certificate? Can they start selling right away?
With the registration certificate, they can start looking for a distributor in India who will handle the sales and distribution of their device.
So they need a local partner.
Yeah.
What about actually getting the device into India? I imagine there's some logistics involved.
Oh, definitely. To import the device into India, the manufacturer has to apply for an import license, and that's where Forms 8 and 9 come in. These forms are available from the CDSCO and, importantly, have to include the details of the chosen distributor.
So they got to have their distributor sorted out and then file the import paperwork. What's the last step?
The CDSCO reviews the application, and if everything looks good, they issue an import license using Form 10. This license is also valid for up to 3 years or until the registration certificate expires, whichever comes first. Once they have that import license, they're officially allowed to market their device in India.
Wow. It's quite a journey, just like in the US and EU. It's clear that India is serious about medical device regulation, but I saw in the presentation that India has some new medical device regulations. Can you tell us about those?
Yes, in 2017, India put in place new medical device rules. These came into effect on January 1st, 2018. These rules apply to both medical devices and in vitro diagnostic devices and aim to make the regulatory framework even stronger, ensuring the safety and quality of these products in the Indian market.
So they're keeping up with the times and making sure their regulations are top-notch. What are some of the key changes that these new rules brought about?
One of the biggest changes is that they introduced an online portal for applications.
Oh, wow.
Manufacturers can now find and fill out the necessary forms for licensing and registration right on the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare's website. This makes the whole process way more accessible and streamlined.
That's a great move towards making the process more efficient.
Yeah.
So we've traveled across 3 continents, exploring the complex world of medical device regulations in the US, the EU, and India. It's been really interesting to see how they're similar and different in their approaches. What stands out to you about these different systems?
What strikes me is that even though they have different structures and specific requirements, all 3 regions have one thing in common: a risk-based approach to regulation.
Makes sense.
They all understand that not all devices are the same in terms of risk. They've all developed systems to make sure the level of scrutiny matches how much a device could potentially impact patients.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance between supporting innovation and making sure patients are safe. What else stands out to you?
Another really important thing is the role of clinical studies, especially for those high-risk Class 3 devices.
Right.
Showing that a device is safe and effective in humans is non-negotiable, and these studies are the proof they need to ensure these devices actually deliver on their promises.
It's good to know that there are such thorough processes in place to evaluate these devices before they reach patients.
Yeah.
Any other key takeaways you'd like to mention before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
One last thought I'd like to leave you with is that this field is constantly changing. The world of medical devices is always evolving, with new technologies emerging all the time. And as these technologies get more advanced, the rules and regulations will have to adapt to keep pace.
It's like a moving target.
Exactly. For example, the EU is really putting a lot of emphasis on research and development in its medical device sector. This will probably shape future regulations and drive the development of even more cutting-edge medical technologies. And India, with its rapidly changing regulations and growing market, is also set for big growth in its medical device sector. Their new medical device rules from 2017 show they're committed to improving patient safety and building a strong and innovative industry.
Sounds like exciting times ahead for the world of medical devices. But with all this growth and innovation, what are some of the challenges, especially for a rapidly developing market like India?
I think one of the biggest challenges for India is that they need more government involvement and infrastructure development. Even though the new regulations are a step in the right direction, stronger government support in the sector could really help improve regulatory oversight and make sure high-quality medical devices are reaching patients. Also, adopting guidelines from groups like the Global Harmonization Task Force, or GHTF, could improve the quality and reliability of clinical studies in India. This would align them with international standards and encourage global collaboration in medical device development.
So it sounds like India has a lot of potential, but also some hurdles to overcome. But for now, we'll pause our exploration here, having covered the regulatory landscapes of the US, the EU, and India. We've delved into the complexities, the focus on risk assessment, and the importance of clinical studies.
Yeah, it really is. Always pushing the boundaries of what we can do in healthcare.
And as things advance, that brings up new questions and challenges for those who regulate it. It's like trying to hit a moving target, right?
Exactly. Take software as a medical device, for example.
Okay.
These are algorithms and programs used to, diagnose diseases, suggest treatments, or even control devices that are implanted in the body.
Wow, that's amazing. But how do you even regulate something that's basically lines of code?
That is the question.
Right.
The traditional ways of figuring out something safe and effective, like clinical trials, don't always work so well in the software world. You're dealing with algorithms that are constantly learning and changing based on the data they're given.
So it's not just about the software, but also the data it learns from.
Absolutely. The quality of that data, how diverse it is, and whether it represents the real world are all critical. If the data is biased or incomplete, the software could give unreliable or even dangerous results.
That's a whole new level of complexity compared to regulating traditional devices. How are regulatory bodies adapting to all this?
They're working on it. There's a lot of discussion and collaboration right now to develop new frameworks and guidelines for software as a medical device. One of the key things they're focusing on is making sure these algorithms are transparent and explainable.
Explainable? What does that even mean when we're talking about software?
It means being able to understand how the algorithm got to its conclusion. This is super important for building trust in these systems and making sure healthcare professionals can interpret the results and make informed decisions.
So it's a balancing act, right? encouraging innovation, but also making sure these technologies are used responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. And it's not just up to the regulators. Manufacturers, healthcare providers, even patients all have a part to play in shaping this new landscape.
Speaking of patients, what can we do to stay in the loop about these advancements and the changing regulations? It feels like a lot of this happens behind closed doors.
You're right, a lot of it does. But there are resources out there. The FDA website, for instance, is a goldmine of information. They publish details about approved devices, safety alerts, even guidance documents for manufacturers.
So if we want to dig deeper, the FDA website is a good place to start.
Definitely. You can also keep up with things by following industry publications and organizations focused on medical device regulation. There's a ton of information out there if you want to learn more.
It's empowering to understand the processes behind something as important as healthcare. It makes you a more informed participant in your own health journey.
I totally agree. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your health.
Now, we've talked a lot about the US and EU, the big players in the medical device world. But what about the rest of the globe? Are there any emerging trends or challenges that stand out?
Absolutely. The medical device market is truly global, and we're seeing lots of activity in regions like Asia and South America. One big trend is harmonization of regulations. Countries are increasingly working together to align their standards. This can make things easier for manufacturers and boost international trade.
Harmonization sounds like a good thing. Less red tape, more access to innovative devices. Are there any drawbacks to consider?
One potential challenge is making sure those harmonized regulations don't sacrifice safety or quality. Every country has its own unique healthcare system and patient population. It's important to stay flexible to address those specific needs.
It's like trying to make a one-size-fits-all solution when we know healthcare is anything but one-size-fits-all.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, but the aim is to find a system that promotes innovation, protects patients, and ensures everyone around the world has access to life-changing medical technologies.
So what does the future hold for medical device regulations? With all the advancements in technology, it's hard to know what's coming next.
It really is a fascinating time to be working in this field. Things like personalized medicine, artificial intelligence, and even 3D printing are all going to revolutionize how we develop and use medical devices.
It sounds like we're on the verge of some incredible breakthroughs.
We are. And with those breakthroughs will come new regulatory hurdles and ethical questions. But I believe that by working together, being innovative, and staying focused on patient safety, we can create a future where these technologies reach their full potential and improve countless lives.
It's inspiring to think about the possibilities. But for now, let's take a step back and reflect on what we've discussed so far. We've looked at the regulatory landscapes of three big players in the medical device world: the US, the EU, and India. We've seen how these systems, even though they're different in how they're structured and what they specifically require, all share the same goal of ensuring safety and effectiveness through risk-based assessments and rigorous testing. We've also talked about how this field is constantly changing, the difficulties of regulating software as a medical device, and the growing trend of harmonizing regulations between different countries. So what does all this mean for the future of medical device regulation? What are some of the big questions and challenges that lie ahead?
One of the biggest challenges is keeping pace with how fast technology is advancing. The regulations need to be flexible and adaptable enough to deal with these innovations without compromising safety or quality.
It's a race to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's not just about keeping up with the technology itself, it's also about dealing with the ethical and social impacts of these advancements. Like, as AI becomes more important in healthcare, we need to think about things like bias, transparency, and accountability.
It's not just about the science, it's about the human impact, too.
Exactly. And as these technologies become more integrated into our lives, it's crucial for patients to be informed and involved in the regulatory process.
So how can patients get involved and make their voices heard? Is it just about staying informed, or are there more proactive things we can do?
Staying informed is a great first step, but you can also join patient advocacy groups, take part in public consultations, even reach out to your elected officials to share your thoughts on these important issues.
It's empowering to know that we can have a say in shaping the future of healthcare. But for now, we'll pause our exploration here.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's come back to the present.
Okay, yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the what ifs.
For sure. So to really wrap up our deep dive, into this really interesting world of medical device regulations, what are some key takeaways our listeners can kind of take with them.
Well, I hope they've gotten a sense of just how complex this whole field is.
Yeah.
There are so many moving pieces, so many different people involved, from scientists and engineers to manufacturers, regulators, healthcare providers, and, of course, patients.
Yeah, it's like a whole ecosystem all working together.
It really is. And right at the center of it all is this constant balancing act between, encouraging innovation and ensuring safety.
Right.
We have to make sure these technologies, which can really change lives, are developed responsibly and get to the people who need them, but without cutting corners on quality or putting patients at risk.
That's a really important point. And I think it highlights another key takeaway.
Yeah.
The importance of staying informed. The world of medical devices is always changing, so it's crucial for all of us as patients, as consumers, to stay involved and educate ourselves about these advancements and the regulations that go along with them.
I couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our health. The more we understand about the devices we use, the better decisions we can make and really advocate for ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question, to really think about.
I'm ready.
Okay, so with all this personalized medicine and artificial intelligence and technology becoming such a big part of our lives, how do you see the very idea of a medical device changing in the future?
Wow, that's a really big question.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how technology is changing the future of healthcare, right?
Yeah.
I think we're going to see the lines get blurry between what we traditionally think of as a medical device and other technologies, right?
Yeah.
We might see wearable sensors that not only keep track of our health data, but also deliver personalized treatments.
Right.
Or even AI-powered assistants that help us manage chronic conditions.
It's almost like science fiction coming to life.
I know, right? It is. And with all those advancements will come a whole new set of regulatory challenges and ethical considerations. But, it's an exciting time to be working in this field, and I'm optimistic that we can tackle those challenges and really use technology to create a healthier future for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of medical device regulations. We hope you've learned some new things and are ready to explore this topic even more on your own. Until next time, stay curious.